Hello.
Hello, hi, can you
Hey,
hear me?
Kate. Yeah, I can hear you fine. You can hear me okay?
I can hear you. It's a little bit low, but I can hear you.
Oh, I got control over that.
Okay, I got my
Let's see.
trusty
Oh,
microphone here.
let's see. I can I got the actually I got the volume all the way up and so I can just speak directly into the mic if that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, well, first, thanks for agreeing to be interviewed.
My pleasure,
You're
Kate.
actually the most famous person I've interviewed so far. I've had this YouTube channel for the past year and a half. My two dogs, Max and Molly, are here. They might get a
Excellent.
little restless, but I can just ignore them. Yeah, I want to say your your recent article in Counterpunch.
Uh-huh.
And article in Counterpunch, the politics of moral outrage, and also your video about that was really interesting. Brought up a lot of interesting stuff about the circular firing squad of the left. I'd like to get back to that a little bit later. Really intriguing topic. First of all, for people who are not familiar with your work, uh, by the way, I want to remind everyone to please like and subscribe if you enjoy my work. Helps me build a channel. Okay, now people who are not familiar with your work, you are a folk singer based in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, I don't use the term folk singer, but yeah, I'm a
Okay.
musician based in Portland, Oregon. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I'm actually in the other Portland, Portland, Maine, or a little ways outside of Portland, Maine. So how did you get involved in this? How did you begin your career?
Oh, I mean, that the answer the
Probably a
answer
long
to that
story.
question is it's a, no, it's just a really short, boring answer. My parents are both musicians, so it was
Okay,
sort
well,
of the
that's
obvious thing to do.
okay.
It was, I
Yeah.
mean, I could expand on it a lot because I don't play the same kind of music that they play, but they're both classical musicians. So I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
when I started playing music at the age of 9, and it was kind of like one of the only obvious career moves, I suppose, for a
Okay,
kid
sure, cool. So
growing up in a household like mine.
yeah,
Yeah.
cool. You come from a musical family. And how did you get involved in leftist politics? Like, as I understand, you started off as a Maoist and you're somewhat more of an anarchist or non-sectarian anarchist, as far as I
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, I would say, yeah, non-sectarian anarchist. Yeah, that would be a good, yeah, or libertarian socialist. I'll go with any of those.
Okay.
But and I went through it. The Maoist phase was a fairly long one in my 20s and late teens. But at the age of 12, I started out more as a sort of my I was really more it was the anti-nuclear movement that was the catalyst, I suppose, for
Okay.
me at the age of 12 when it was I guess I was 10 when 3 Mile Island melted down.
Right.
And then it was like, I mean, the anti-nuke movement was really going full swing, and I wasn't hearing about so much of the stuff that was happening, but a little enough of it was trickling into my little suburban world that I was sort of yeah, an anti-nuke activist, you could
Okay.
say.
That's interesting. Okay. Did you go through a Noam Chomsky stage or Howard Zinn stage?
Oh, big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think I read A People's History of the United States
Yeah.
when it came out. That's when it came out in the early 80s was when I sometime after that, some soon after that, I think was when I first read the book, which was my first Zen book, and it was profoundly impactful for me. And then Chomsky, I think I first discovered Chomsky around the same time, and
Okay.
his writing is more obtuse. So I think I was much more attracted to Zen as a teenager because
Right.
I could understand him.
It's more open, yeah, that's easier. Yeah, Chomsky has a searing critique of U.S. imperialism. I think he's fallen down on the job somewhat in recent years, but he's 95. He's been around for years, so give him some
I
slack.
mean, I think he's just brilliant. I love Chomsky, but as far as his ability to communicate with the general public, I think he's best with an interpreter. Like David Barsamian has done a fantastic job of popularizing
Right.
Chomsky for the masses.
Right,
I think.
his interviews are interesting. I used to read him in Z Magazine when that was out. Chomsky had an article in there, and Michael Albert. I know you interviewed Michael Albert in one of your interviews, which was kind of interesting. The Paracon Project. Okay.
Yeah.
Now you recently completed a tour of Europe and the UK. I was reading. little bit about your blog. It seemed to have gone well. Was there kind of a hassle with like COVID, with getting visas and stuff going in and out of countries? Was that more of a problem than usual, or
Yeah, it was a disaster. It wasn't a matter of getting visas. It was just a matter of like I had like I think it's a little more than 20 gigs originally booked, and 6 of them were canceled.
right?
3 because of travel reasons, 2 because of the troll who's trying to get all my gigs canceled all the time,
Right.
and 1 because the owner of the pub died of COVID-19.
Right. You mentioned that. That was sad, right?
Yeah, but that's also unusual. I mean, it's not like this kind of stuff happens normally on a tour.
Right. Right.
6 cancellations, one of the pub owners dying, none of that happens normally, you know.
Yeah, yeah, it's just pretty scary. Yeah, well, and you mentioned you went to an Assange solidarity rally. I believe was that in London? And
Yeah, in London,
outside Belmarsh.
yeah, I timed the tour to coincide with the COP26
Right.
meetings in Glasgow, but it also just happened that I also timed the tour to coincide with Julian Assange's extradition trial in London at the Royal Courts of Justice, where I had a gig actually in London the night of the rally there, and so I was basically doing gigs around Southern England around the time of those trials. So I just kept on coming back to London,
Okay.
doing a lot of extra driving to be
Yeah.
in London every day for the royal courts. But it was really a fairly impressive turnout of supporters, and
Okay.
the network of people that are supporting him around the world is a very impressive
Right.
bunch of folks. But of
Right.
course, the people trying to put him in prison for the rest of his life are very powerful as well.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
More powerful,
That
perhaps.
whole thing is bizarre. Like the person who got the evidence on him, Icelandic guy who turned out to be a pedophile and have a long criminal record, he's mentally unstable. I forget his name offhand. The whole
Right?
trial is falling apart, but the government, U.S. government, is still prosecuting him. It's so
Yeah.
bizarre.
Yeah, Merrick Garland, this great progressive, apparently, supposedly. But if he's really great progressive, Merrick Garland dropped the charges now. Come on.
Yeah, they're, they're not going to do that. I don't think they're going to do.
No, this was Trump's extradition case, and just like with the offshoring of refugees in Mexico and all this, these Trump policies are being embraced by the Biden administration.
Yeah, people thought Biden would be an alternative to Trump, but he's doing the same shit. He's treating immigrants just as horribly, continuing. He got out of Afghanistan. I give him credit for that. And apparently, he's reduced drone warfare somewhat, but he's still doing a lot of horrible stuff around the world. Anyway, when you were touring Europe, you mentioned you were playing at clubs and pubs. Were you fundraising for like socialist organizations or local activist groups or causes, or who did you mostly play for?
Well, I mean, most of the gigs that I'm doing are well, I mean, basically, it really varies a lot, but usually, the organizers of the shows are from the left and different kinds of groups, and I sing for a lot of different, about a lot of different things. So there's a lot of different left wing groups that organize shows for me
Okay,
in different countries, and then some of them are benefits,
right,
others aren't. It depends on whether there's a sponsoring organization with a budget, basically, because I can't afford to be traveling around doing benefits if I'm not getting paid. Then that doesn't
right, yeah,
work
right,
because the
right.
landlord is very hungry.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you know,
You wrote a couple songs about that too.
yeah, a lot of songs about strangling that idiot
Yeah,
who isn't actually a person; it's a corporation. So
right.
I mean, I don't know how to strangle the corporation, but if anybody can tell me how, I'll do it.
It takes collective action to do that. Yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
yeah. So you were talking about the more difficulties of being a performer, a musical artist in the days of in the era of Spotify. The margin is so much more difficult after Spotify went public, and it's so. Do you make your living from doing this, or how does that work?
Yeah, I do, but it's always like it's always a qualifier, kind of thing. Like when I mean, if you ask any independent artist, do you make a living at this? If they just answer with a simple yes, then that might be whatever in their minds that might be accurate. But basically, almost nobody's actually making a living at this anymore.
Yeah.
And those of us who are surviving at it have some kind of advantage. Like we have enough of a fan base that we are able to translate that into economics. So that's in my case. I'm raising money from all of my or many of my fans, 5% of them or so, who give me money every month, $5 a month, and that sort of thing. So I'm surviving because of outfits like Patreon and the concept of sort of like NPR or Pacifica style fundraising, where you give them free content and then they give you money in appreciation for the free content in order for you to keep on producing free content.
Yeah.
So it's not a good economic model in terms of being able to afford to make good recordings, but it works more or less at this point for me in terms of bare survival, which meaning like paying the rent and keeping the family alive.
Right.
But it's not like there's no, it's not like we're saving money or anything like that. And also, um, if I mean, in my case, we're paying exorbitant amounts of rent, but like in so many cases, if any artist is surviving at this, it's probably because they live in their parents' house. It's probably because they've inherited a house, and
Yeah.
this is not at all to denigrate anybody who has inherited a house. It's a wonderful thing, but this is almost necessary at this point, because I mean, yeah, I mean, it's somebody in my position. The only reason it's possible for me to crowdfund the kind of money that I'm getting every month from my supporters is because I have so many fans. And the only reason I have so many fans is because I've been at this for a long time. I mean, it's not because, obviously not commercial radio promotion or anything. It's because I've been touring so much. But the only reason I've been able to tour so much for such a long time is because I used to make a living at that.
Right.
Because touring used to be something you could really quite, I think, if you had any kind of a fan base, you could pretty, not, I wouldn't say easily, but you could make a living at it, because half your income or more would come from CD sales. So even if you didn't have a great, even if you didn't have a huge turnout or make a whole lot of money from the gigs themselves, if you got a good fan base and they really like your stuff, and a couple dozen folks are coming to your shows, and that'll turn into enough CD sales that you can make a living. But that all changed with Spotify, of
Right.
course.
Spotify. Yeah. And
It
YouTube
didn't
and
it
other.
didn't just well, YouTube, but it was really I mean, basically before back when we had some kind of control over the internet, like what we our presence on the internet before it was all taken over by corporations. If you wanted to give away your music, you could give away your music, but then you could harvest people's emails and exchange, which people didn't even realize exactly how valuable that was at the time, because a lot of people didn't have this concept of data being so valuable, but it's very valuable. And so if you can get people's emails when they're downloading your songs, it's so worth giving away your music in that case. It's amazing. It's like, I mean, it's an amazing thing. You're to harvest, to get that many emails from people just because they're downloading your music. I mean, it seems like a fantasy now, because we have so little control over how we interact with the public as musicians. We have handed that over to these corporations, and I mean, we didn't have much of a choice in the matter either. But you know, it used to be that you would really benefit from giving away your music. And then when Spotify started their free tier and everybody started getting free music that way, you don't collect emails from people who download your music. People don't download your music; they stream it, and they do that anonymously, or it's not anonymous for Spotify. Spotify knows who they are,
Yeah.
but we don't. But the
Yeah.
musicians don't.
So the
We
artists are
we we
frozen
just
out.
get told a number. Spotify gives us a number.
Right.
Here's how many people are listening to you this month. Here's where they are. We're not telling you who they are.
Right. So it's
That's
ego
only for them to
satisfying.
know.
Yeah, but it's not much you can do about it and do with it. Yeah. Um.
Unless we could get them to change their business model, but that's going to take, taking on a massive global corporation.
Right. 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 How long have you been touring?
Since I mean, like full time since 1997.
Okay, so
Uh,
it's about almost 20 years.
yeah, 20.
When
4 years, and
24
then
years. Yeah, okay.
before that, I was making a living as a musician playing in the subways of Boston. But
Okay. Okay. I used to live in Boston. Yeah, I hear
mm,
you mentioned you played at the community church in Boston. I heard like via Zoom or right before this. Yeah,
yep,
I used to go there occasionally. Really cool people there. Really cool people. They had the Raging Grannies. I don't know if they're
yeah.
still around, but
The Raging Grannies are in cities throughout North America and
right.
elsewhere in the world. They originally started in Victoria, British
Okay.
Columbia, and
Okay.
they became a global phenomenon.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. They're cool. They're cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess it's so much more difficult now for younger people to break into what you're doing to start start a career as a independent musician. I guess it's so much
Yep.
more difficult right now.
It's much more difficult in terms of the finances of it. It's not more difficult in terms of the accessibility of potential audience online
Right. There's an
and getting your
audience there.
music out there online and recording high quality recording for very low cost or free. I mean, this kind of stuff there are advantages to the modern
Right.
situation, but the big disadvantage is being able to tour and play for live audiences and make any kind of money at that, because you got the dual kind of, or maybe I'd say the three pronged basic problem of the extreme rise in the cost of living and cost of housing, primarily for so many musicians, combined with the your income suddenly being cut in half or whatever. If you
Right.
ever made a living selling merch, you now sell nothing, and your income has dramatically fallen.
Right.
I mean, there's those are two big factors. Now, what was the third one? I need more coffee. I can't remember what the third factor was.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. I'm drinking lots of coffee. Yeah. Interesting. Um.
That's the problem with these Zoom things. You can't pass me a coffee.
Yeah. I would if I could, but yeah. Yeah. This is my third cup this morning, so I'm kind of. It's earlier for you too. I think it's 3 hour time difference. But yeah, are there
Yeah.
any attempts or explorations of an alternate business model for artists? A different model, like a an artist musicians union or
Mm.
something? Are there
Oh
explorations?
yeah, I remember the third factor is the lack of venues
Yeah.
that actually pay. That's the other thing. But yeah, the I mean, basically the model, the alternative model. I mean, the industry, being an independent musician over the past 20-25 years has meant reinventing your career uh, model or your business model several times. Because so, I mean, alternative model. I would say the alternative model, which is now no longer alternative, is crowdfunded
Mm,
patronage. I mean,
mhm.
that's the model that rose up in direct response to Spotify starting its free tier. Although it didn't. I don't know how conscious people were at the time. That this crowdfunded patronage, like Patreon, became so popular right at the time that Spotify started their free tier. But looking back on it, that was exactly the what happened. It was Spotify that drove this
Drove people too.
this
That's interesting.
yeah.
You two
But
patron.
that is the alternative model. I mean, the old model was much more sort of basic transactional. You play a concert, people buy tickets, people buy CDs if they like your music, and that's a very simple, straightforward. I mean, some musicians, even back when that was the model, some in the punk scene were uncomfortable with charging for shows and uncomfortable with charging for CDs. So that kind of anti-consumerist self-sabotage, that sort of was born out of the more sort of unrealistic elements of the 60s subculture, perhaps, that you could say, or maybe it predates the 60s. I don't know, but I'm familiar with the 60s subculture and the sort of and the punk subculture that followed it, with both of whom, whether we're talking about the freaks in the 60s or the punks in the 70s and 80s, whatever terms we're using to describe these subcultures, these subcultures all came with an extreme distrust of consumerism or anything having to do with buying anything.
Yes.
So there's pros and cons to that kind of allergic reaction to money. I mean, I think money is a scary thing that everybody should be You know, yeah, there's lots of good reason to reject consumerism, but at the same time, you know, people need to make a living. So there was a lot of self sabotage going on in the music scene prior to the industry itself sabotaging
Right.
us, you know.
Right.
But then, of course, when Spotify came along, whether you wanted to sell your CDs or charge for shows, you know, you suddenly were often not in a position to do that anymore anyway. So we all joined that kind of club, whether we wanted to or not.
Right. It's interesting. A friend of mine has a saying that capitalism sucks, but that's where the money is. But yeah,
Yeah,
we live under capitalism. Not much you can do about it. But with some
that's a
with some
great way to sum it up. Capitalism sucks, but that's where the money is.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. Yeah, have you noticed audiences changing over the years? People go to your shows, or in general, have you noticed any major change?
Oh, definitely. I
Okay.
mean, but for me, I mean that's going to vary depending on the artist, you know. So like there's a lot of artists that whether they had a hit or not, there's a phenomenon, especially if you have had a hit. There's this phenomenon of you get a certain audience at a certain time, and then that audience continues to be your audience for the rest of
Okay.
your career. So there's a lot of artists who you know were kind of well known in the 80s, and the most of the people coming to their shows are still the same crowd that came in the 80s. They just keep on getting older at like
Right.
the artists do. But then and that's, you know, not knocking that, that's great if you got an audience wherever they come from, that's wonderful. But my audience changes over time, partly, and partly, you know, it's the same crowd that grows up with me. But then there's also new folks who start coming to shows, and it varies depending on the country and the scene in the country. I tour in a bunch of different countries, so it's very much there are different scenes that are very much within different national borders.
Mhm.
National borders really matter, and they make a huge difference. They have a
Hmm.
tremendous influence on the political and social scene in any given country. Even though the internet is also there and also having its impact, what's happening, you know, politically and economically and in other things, you know, in terms of immigration policy. I mean, you know, there's so many different things that cause a country to have its own culture. I mean,
Right.
it seems it would have been such an obvious thing to say 20 years ago that it seems stupid to have to point it out now. But you know, to those people out there who think the internet is reality, it's not. And you know, reality is still in the physical world, to at least a very significant degree. I don't know how we measure these things, but what's going on in a country is very much defined by the borders of that country and the media ecosystem and a lot of other things, the political
Right.
history, a lot of things. So, like in Denmark specifically, there I have new crowds of young teenagers coming to my shows every year, and but that's because part of a they're part of a sort of left scene where my music is part of the scene. And
Nice.
so if you're, you know, you when you're young and you're getting into the Socialist Youth Federation and you get your copy of the SUF songbook, page 3, it's St. Patrick Battalion. So
Okay.
you know,
Okay.
you know, that's I'm part of their political education. So you know that, and that's also the case to some degree because of Spotify and other places, you know, with the youth audience. You know, they find me on Spotify, and so then, you know, then they'll come to my shows. And so there's, when the audience isn't just aging with me, you know, there's different reasons for it, and that varies depending on the country and the
Right.
scene, you know. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I thought it was interesting. You talked about your blog and when you were in Belfast, like Irish nationalism has a strong internationalist component to it there. Like there's
Yeah.
solidarity with the Palestinian cause, solidarity with Native Americans and struggles worldwide. So it's really interesting within the context of the fight for Irish rights. Really
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, and that's what you'll find that in what in struggles around the world that are thought of as sort of national struggles or struggles for national liberation or struggles for sovereignty, or whatever, however they're characterized. But when you're talking about a country that's occupied by a colonial power, and whether it's a traditional, so-called, whatever we might call traditional colonial power like Great Britain, or a more new colonial power like India, which of course used to be a colony of Great Britain and is now a colonial power in its own right over ethnic minorities that are rebelling against domination by the little clique that runs much of India. Just to take an example, I mean, the Kashmir struggle, for example, or the struggle in, under Palestine occupied by the Israelis, or the the struggle of the American Indian movement in the U.S., and the Native uprising in '91 in Canada, for example. I mean, there's so many of these, like, whether it's a long-standing movement or an uprising that only sort of lasted for a certain amount of time. When these things are happening, they often find each other. These connections get made because they understand each other. You go to Belfast and you'll meet people from the Basque country, regularly, and you'll meet Palestinians, and you'll even occasionally meet Native Americans. And this is not coincidental. They're all part of militants, as we call them, as the media calls them, from different kinds of struggles. When it comes to the anti-colonial struggle, the struggle for sovereignty, they tend to find each other, and they have a lot in common, and they understand each other. And I've seen that so much in Belfast. I mean, the first time I was in Belfast playing music there was soon after Mozambique had gotten out of Guantanamo, and just the clear, obvious, immediate sense of brotherhood and sisterhood and familiarity between the Irish former prisoners and the former prisoners from Guantanamo, was just, it was just electric, the atmosphere. I mean, everybody knew what it was like to have a hood put over your head, and they all, they would refer to each other as the hooded men. This is another term they use to describe each other.
Right. Well, that's interesting. Really interesting. What I've seen of the mural art there is really cool.
Yeah.
Really amazing mural
They
art.
really keep the history, recent and older history, so alive on the streets of the city, all over West Belfast and Ardoyne and different neighborhoods, with those wonderful murals. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Cool. Was there a place you enjoyed performing better than others, or that you prefer, that you had most fun in? Would you say?
I mean, generally, the most I tend to like, the my favorite kind of atmosphere is a bit random. So, and it won't always happen on a given tour, and it's not always about the place. It's often about just accidents of timing and who's organizing the gig. But I mean, I love playing in theaters,
Okay.
the best, so I love theaters much more than pubs and other kinds of, noisier atmospheres. Theater is
Yeah.
really
Right.
made for, storytelling and music, and really engaging with an audience, and the lighting and everything, the sound, everything is set up for that in an
Okay.
old fashioned kind of theater, like an old theater, the kind that were made for acoustic performances, like that maybe have up to 400 seats that you can play for acoustically because of the way it's set up, that kind of gig. But my other than that, I mean, where the audiences are most enthusiastic, and most likely to be singing along, and most likely to know all the words, so that tends to be Belfast,
Okay.
Glasgow, London, and Copenhagen. I guess those four cities are probably my favorite places to play, just because of the way the audiences are.
Okay. That's interesting. Wow. Now, when you were in Europe, when you were touring, do you drive yourself, or do you take a bus, or?
Usually, so far, I tend to fly to some hub city and then rent a car there, and then get around by rental car. So, and then when I'm going from somewhere like England or Ireland to a continental European country, then I'll fly between those
Right.
points and then rent a car. It tends to be, although now that I've recently gotten into playing the mandola, I'm inclined to actually do a tour where I don't rent a car. Actually, I'm thinking of doing a tour by on foot, walking around the moors in England,
Huh.
or at least maybe I'll also take trains, and that kind of thing is much more realistic with a light
Yeah.
instrument like a mandola. And I mean, you see all the movies of the people walking around with guitars and touring by train, and that only works in the movies. In reality, people have backs, and you can't go around carrying a guitar like that. That only works when you're 20 years old. And the
Right.
rest of
Right.
us, you have to actually watch your health. It's basically like, yeah, you can't just travel around carrying all that weight all the time. That's just a recipe for early death.
Right.
Because this is not it's not like a occasional vacation. This is my job.
Yeah.
I
Right.
can't
Right.
I can't be carrying that shit around all the time.
Yeah. Right. It's too difficult. It's interesting. Right. Okay. Interesting. I like. Can I ask a few questions about some of your songs?
Of course.
Okay. One song. They all sang the Internationale, which is really moving. The first time I heard it, I cried a little. It's really moving. You've heard there's a woman. Sorry.
Yeah,
You can't remember.
Katerina Jakob.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Katerina Yakov. Now, as I remember, she in the song she's a German labor organizer, and she's captured by the Gestapo probably towards the end of the war. They're marching her somewhere, and she's liberated by the Soviet army. And now, is this a true story, or is it based on someone? Or
Yeah, it's a true story. I basically, um, there's a couple of wonderful young women in Hamburg, both of whom have since moved to Arctic Norway, but they were in Hamburg for a long time, and one of them, her her name is Katarina Jakob, and her grandmother's name was Katarina Jakob, and her grandmother is the person, the woman who the song is about,
okay,
and every detail is true. And of course, there's a lot more details that aren't in the song because
sure,
it's a
sure,
song in this. But yeah, she and her husband Franz Jakob. And Franz Jakob was executed by the Nazis in
okay,
1944 in September. He was a communist city councilor on the city council of Hamburg
okay,
before the Nazis took over,
mhm,
and Katerina was also very. It was, she wasn't an elected official. Her husband was, but she was. Other than that, she was active in all the same circles as a communist and as a labor organizer, and as a dissident. And basically, she was she but she was also German and not Jewish, So it wasn't like she was immediately rounded up and sent to the death camps for being a Jew, but she was, as a politically active, left wing German. She faced very similar kind of fate, potentially, but she was actually. I mean, it tells you something about the situation in terms of how they were, different elements of society, and how they were targeted to different degrees. Like, she wasn't immediately rounded up and shot. She was arrested 7 times, and she served 7 different sentences during the Second World War. And it was at during her seventh prison sentence that she was actually supposed to be released, because there was still a judicial system functioning under the Nazis that was, you know, not independent, but it was, sort of, it wasn't just all decisions being made by the dictator. There were judges and there were courts and stuff. And she was released 7 times, 6 times.
wow,
The seventh time, when she was going to get released, the seventh time,
yeah,
that's when the Gestapo stepped in, because the Gestapo always had in any of these trials, the Gestapo could always just
oh,
overturn the results and do whatever they wanted to, which they frequently did. But in her case, in this case, in the seventh trial, that's when, before she was released, they said, nope, we're taking her. And they took her to a concentration camp.
right,
And the reason she survived the war was because that was when she was taken to the camp. I believe at that point that was 1944, and it was on May 1st, 1945, that they were on a death march, and which was, and the death marches. I mean, they called them, the term death march was coined by the prisoners themselves, because you were talking about a group of people who had been starved for years generally, who, if they were alive, then they were near death anyway because they were barely being fed, and among other lots of other things. But one of the main problems in the concentration camps was that the Nazis were just barely feeding these prisoners, right? So they were basically near death anyway. So then, when they were told they had to march from the camp to Berlin, which was like, I don't know, 100 miles away or whatever, that was a death sentence for many people, because marching like that, they would fall over, and and anybody that fell over would be killed. So you just had to keep marching or you'd be killed. And so, yeah, she was one of. Then when the Red Army came on the morning of May 1st, of all days, and of course, for a group of people, many of whom were communists, May Day, being liberated on May Day, had profound significance. I mean, they would have been happy to be liberated by the Red Army any day of the year, but it happened to be the morning of May 1st, International Workers' Day. So they all started singing the Internationale, together in many different languages, when they realized that the Nazi troops were gone and they were surrounded by Russian tanks and
Right.
Russian soldiers. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. What did she do after the war? Did she stay in Germany or?
Yep. Yep. She stayed in Germany, and she and her surviving daughters became all very actively anti-fascist,
Okay.
sort of organizers. I mean, there was, for so many of the people who survived the camps, and for the children who grew up during the war, there has been a long-standing tradition, very much organized by a lot of different groups, to travel around and speak at schools, and to make sure that the German people remember.
Right.
So, yeah, she did a lot of that
Okay.
in the rest of her years, as did her daughter,
Right.
who's still with us today. She's an elderly woman in Hamburg.
Okay. Interesting. Wow. I gotta look. Wow. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh yeah.
One another song. The last. I believe it's called the last Lincoln veteran. That
Hmm.
survivor of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Lincoln was originally Lincoln Washington Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. Now, was that a specific individual, a person? Okay, I
Yeah.
know, I might know who it is, but I'm not sure. Years ago, one of my early exposures to the left, I knew a guy named Abe Asherhoff, who is
Oh
probably
yeah.
long gone now. He was a
Yeah.
carpenter. I knew him in Etna, New Hampshire. He built a house. He owned a house in LA, and he was a filmmaker. I didn't know him super well, but I used to work for a bookstore, and he was friends with one of my coworkers. He invited me to a couple of his parties. Okay, fascinating guy. Is that who it's about, or?
Which bookstore was that?
I
No.
worked for the Dartmouth bookstore
Oh,
in
great.
Hanover, New Hampshire. It was an independent
Yeah.
bookstore, but a fair number of leftists, strange as it sounds, used to come in and out of there.
Oh
One of my
yeah.
coworkers was a guy named John Wing, who was a leftist of some sort. Anyway, he was friends with Abe Asherhoff and used to bump, fascinating guy, used to bump into him. I'm sure he's long gone by now, but
Abe was a wonderful guy, and he did die some time ago. But Abe was really one of the really the backbones of the left in Seattle
okay.
for a long time. And
Yeah.
I don't know when he moved to Seattle, but he was clearly from the East Coast, as anybody familiar with East Coast accents would know. But he lived for a long time in Seattle, and that's where I first. I don't think I ever met him, but I was in the room with Abe Asheroff on many occasions, hearing him speak at different events in the 80s in Seattle,
Right.
in the 90s in Seattle. And then I think it was, I can't remember when he died, but it was, yeah. But the actual last surviving member of the Lincoln Brigade did die just not long ago.
Okay.
But the song that I wrote was about Bob Steck, who was a good friend of mine when he was in his 70s and I was in my 20s, and he lived to be 95, and he died around 2000, early 2000s. But he he lived in Connecticut, in Connecticut, not far from my mom, when I was young, and so that's how we met. and um, and yeah, he was. It was certainly. I never knew another member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade particularly well, but it was quite something to meet this guy and just to learn about his history. I mean, not only was he longstanding member of the, I mean, he was a longstanding active member of the left in the New York area as former director of activities at this interracial summer camp called Camp Unity in upstate New York in
Okay.
Wingdale, and which was long gone by the time I was around. But basically, he was involved with a lot of local left institutions that were known to people who are fans of this kind of culture and politics, and then also, of course, he was also a member of the Lincoln Brigade, and the Spanish Civil War, the brigades that came from the U.S. Of course, there are tens of thousands of people that came from all over the world to fight alongside the Spanish Republic against the fascists. But for the ones who came from the United States were mainly in the Washington Battalion and the Lincoln Battalion, of course, both named as was Communist Party practice at the time, named after Americans in an effort to embrace the motto of the Communist Party in the 1930s, which was "Communism is 20th
Mhm.
century Americanism." That was the term, and Bob loved that.
Hmm.
And Bob was a big fan of that concept, and a big fan of the more radical history of the U.S. and the American Revolution, and he was himself a historian and taught history for 30 years in high
Hmm.
schools in the Bronx after
Interesting.
long
Wow.
after the Civil War. Yeah.
Interesting story. Wow. That's cool. Interesting. You have another song about the St. Patrick's Battalion. There, I know some of the history behind, but a lot of people probably don't. They're Irish immigrants, came to the U.S. They fought for Mexico in the Mexican-American War. They saw what the U.S. was doing. They were horrified, and they made them like switch sides and fought for Mexico. A lot of them were later on were actually hung. They were captured by the U.S. and they were hung as traitors, which is really sad. But the story is interesting and really inspiring, and not a lot of people
Yeah.
know about it.
Yeah. And it is it is definitely one of the most popular songs that I've written, and you can, I mean, just not that I've ever had a hit or anything like that, but these days, of course, with Spotify and YouTube, you get to figure out what songs of yours are the ones that are striking the nerve the most, and that one is every day I get a comment from somebody in Spanish as well as in English, saying uh, positive things about Ireland and Mexico, and long live the connection and our Irish brothers and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, that's it's a story that's much less well known than the Spanish Civil War, and the international brigades in Spain, which of course is the iconic, sort of story of international solidarity that a lot of people are familiar with. But the battalion, the St. Patrick Battalion, of course, predates the Spanish Civil War by 80 years or whatever, and it's quite a story. And most of them were killed in battle. There were 202 of them. Some of them were not Irish. There were a couple from England and
Okay.
also Poles, several Poles.
Hmm.
But they most of them, the overwhelming majority, were Irish, and they most of them were killed in battle, and then a whole bunch of them were hanged. Even though the Pope eventually the president of the U.S. Eventually who was it? The Pope and some other really prominent politicians were actually trying to not get them hung, but there were a whole bunch of them were hung. I think some were pardoned, as like 15 of them were pardoned and branded with a D for deserter on their face, and made to help hang their comrades.
Yeah.
But they were then released. And those who survived, some of whom escaped from the last battle, the last of 5 battles that they fought with the U.S. Army, after the Battle of Churubusco, a whole bunch, several dozen, I think, survived and got away, and rather than being captured and killed, which was going to be their fate if they got captured by the U.S., and they lived out their lives in what is now Mexico City, in the San Jalisco neighborhood,
Okay.
which is where this big convent is and was. that had this big, huge, beautiful stone building. Mexico City is like a medieval city. There's so many buildings, so many beautiful old stone buildings that are 400 or 500 years old,
Yeah.
and people may not realize if they haven't been there. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. But this in the San Jalisco neighborhood, there's this old convent, and they lived in the convent until they found other places to live after the war,
Right.
and many of them, settled down with Mexican women and had families, and people proudly talk about the red-haired folks in the neighborhood, and proudly, you know, hope that they might be related to these Irish, to their Irish brothers who
Right.
fought
Right.
for Mexico.
It's really right, interesting history. Really interesting history. Another song, I guess, "What Would Jesus Bomb?" I guess this kind of comes from the Bush administration, the Bush era, that era. I
Yeah,
mean, it's a cool
yeah.
song.
Who would Jesus bomb?
Who would
And of
Jesus bomb?
course, all those, especially during the evangelical youth movement in the 80s and 90s, and maybe still, I don't know, but they were, a lot of young people were wearing these bracelets that said WWJD. What would Jesus
Right.
do?
Right.
And of course, it's very ironic because these are people coming from this evangelical Christian background. These are people oftentimes who are supporters of U.S. imperialism, uh, and yet they also consider themselves followers of a pacifist. It's very
Hmm.
contradictory.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Like Jesus
and of
himself
course,
was. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
exactly right. No, exactly. I mean, how can you be a follower of this guy, of Jesus, and be in favor of bombing anybody? I mean, it's so obviously contradictory that it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But of course, that was the case during the Crusades. I mean, it's long been the case of followers of Jesus that they turn his words into such acts of wanton violence and genocide. But it's a long-standing tradition, but it's just as bizarre as it was 1,000 years ago when the Crusaders were killing Muslims in the name of
Right.
Jesus.
Same thing. Yeah.
Mm.
Another song here. If I Had a Hammer, and I believe it's about. First thing when I heard the title, I thought it was about the old Peter, Paul, and Mary song. If I Had a Hammer, but apparently it's about an incident in New Zealand in the anti-war movement.
Yeah, in Australia. Yeah,
Australia.
and of course, I took the title. I mean, I deliberately used the same title as the old hit from the '60s, and of course, it's just a different kind of hammer. Perhaps I don't know what kind of hammer they were singing about, but mine is definitely a sledgehammer.
Right.
And it is this tradition that is. I mean, you would think that it might be more well known than it is because it's such a dramatic um, thing to do that it just seems so like it would capture the romantic ideals for a lot more people if they knew about it. And but
Hmm.
it's this tradition of the Catholic workers, of the plowshares, of the swords to plowshares movement in the United States, which has since spread to other countries, especially countries that have much of a Catholic population. So there's been a wonderful actions in England, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, largely conducted by nuns and priests and others who are in their circles, very much in the tradition of the Berrigan brothers from here in the U.S., which are probably the most well-known pair of people who have done a lot of these sorts of actions. But what happened in that song is basically about. I mean, it's kind of about a bunch of things, but it's basically about the WikiLeaks, about Chelsea Manning and the WikiLeaks war crimes uh, information that was publicized by WikiLeaks and leaked by Chelsea Manning's heroic efforts at the military base in Baghdad,
Yeah, the collateral
getting
murder
that
video.
information
Yeah.
out. Yeah, the collateral murder video, exactly, the helicopter massacre, and there were a couple folks in Queensland, Australia, who saw that video, and basically that was what pushed them over the edge to decide that they were going to take sledgehammers onto the military base when there were next time there were going to be U.S. Australia military exercises, which they call war games officially, in Queensland, and and they trespassed onto the base with sledgehammers and found a helicopter gunship that was sitting in place. And as everyone should know, hopefully, if they don't, they need to know that these helicopter gunships, as well as fighter jets, are very fragile, and they are very dangerous. Obviously, when they're in the air and bombing and shooting missiles and all that, but when they're on the ground, they are extremely fragile things. The nose cone of a fighter jet is a very fragile thing that you can destroy with one good swing of a sledgehammer, do $1 million worth of damage, and
Oh,
keep it from flying.
yeah. Good work. Good work.
Yeah,
Yeah. Kind of
yeah.
reminds me of a song years ago by Bruce Coburn. He's a Christian pacifist, but he has if I had a well, I think it was if I had a machine gun or something, he
If I
was
had a rocket
if
launcher,
I had a
if I
rocket
had a
launcher
rocket,
using Central
wonderful, wonderful
America.
song. Yeah,
Yeah,
wonderful song.
it's a great song. Yeah, interesting. You have another song. I'm a better anarchist than you. Now, I come from a Trotskyist background, and there's so much sectarianism in the Trotskyist movement. Like they have apostolic succession. Someone's a Mandalite or a Grantite or a Taffyite or a Robertsonite. I mean, it's so weird, and there might be an incest, similar stuff going on here in other currents of the left. But there's yeah, definitely a circular firing squad mentality. So I wanted to ask you, why is there such a large anarchist community in Portland? What is it about Portland or a large leftist community? I it's almost like stereotyped, is that
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is such
okay?
a large left here compared to other places, but there is. What there is a tradition that only goes back about 30 years of of this city having this reputation
Okay.
of being a sort of haven for left wingers, and so it has become that. But but the history of the place and the reason why there appears to be a larger left scene here, I think, especially historically, it has more to do with the actual opposite in a way, because Oregon was founded by white
It was
supremacists
a sundown
as
state, right?
yeah, it was the sundown state. Really, it was the only state in the union that was founded with white supremacy in the constitution of the
Okay.
state. As a you had to be white to own property in this state.
Mm.
People of color, with some exceptions, could not own property in this state and could not work most professions. And if they were found present in the state, could be beaten twice annually by the authorities,
Right.
whipped publicly for the
Right.
crime of existing in the state. So, as people will note if they travel around the West Coast, there are many more people of color north and south of Oregon than in Oregon itself, and that's because of this history.
Right.
And then also because of this history, Oregon became the center for what organized white supremacists in the 80s when that was having a resurgence that has continued since
Yeah.
then. But so before the group White Aryan Resistance moved to Idaho and was sued into bankruptcy, they were based in Portland.
Okay.
And just a few blocks from here, a Ethiopian man was beaten to death by white supremacists
Right.
in what was it, 83, 93? No, Mulugata Sarah, and I can't remember the date, but it was before I moved here anyway.
Right.
But so there was in the 80s this Nazi movement, and then largely as a response to them, there was an anti-Nazi movement, which of the sort that you had in a lot of different cities in North America and England and Germany and a lot of different parts of the world where there was a right-wing resurgence. There was also a resurgence of left-wingers who were intent on preventing or opposing these right-wing groups. So that's basically I think much more why Portland's in the news so often because of this history of the right wing and it being opposed by the left, as opposed to there's a lot of other parts of the country. As anybody who has lived in a black majority city like Philadelphia or Detroit or any Washington D.C. or Atlanta or any number of other major cities on the East Coast or in the Midwest, whether they're black majority cities or not, but any city with a significant black population, as those of us who have lived in those cities are well aware, the far right is not going to set foot in any working class neighborhood,
Right.
especially particularly working class black or brown neighborhood, right?
Right.
And why is that? Because they're going to get their asses kicked right away. And on the rare occasions they've been stupid enough to try to hold a protest in some place like that, like Toledo is one example, which apparently they didn't. I don't know if they realized how black Toledo was, but they sure found out. But when the Nazis tried to have a march in Toledo back in the late '90s, early 2000s, I mean, they got their asses kicked. They got sent out of there so quick. I don't remember how many dozens of police cars were burned. I mean, they don't do well in those neighborhoods. They come to cities like Portland because they can, and because as militant as some of these young folks, these young white folks may think they are, they're not that militant, and they're not going to, they're not numerous enough, and there's not enough people who feel so strongly about kicking the Nazis out of town to
Right.
do it the way they did in Toledo and a lot of other cities where,
Right.
so I mean, the Nazis come here because it's such a white place,
Okay.
and basically, but there is also a lot of opposition, and certainly in the past 4 years, it's been in the news a lot. But I think that is mainly because the liberal media, as we can now call it, because before the term was like not really accurate, but now CNN and NPR, they are the liberal media. They're playing the role of they are the shills for the Democratic Party,
Right.
and they're almost. I mean, in the case of CNN, they're almost completely open about it, whereas with NPR, there's some pretense of trying to act like they're
Yes.
something else, but
It's pretty
basically
obvious.
they're totally shills for the mainstream of the Democratic Party, not for the Sanders wing, but for the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And so anybody to the left of the mainstream of the DNC, and certainly anyone to the right, they're going to vilify. And during the Trump period, they were vilifying Trump, and they were supporting basically anybody who was protesting against Trump. But if you were protesting around other things that were more broadly around capitalism, like or around things like rent control, which is like getting rid of rent control has been a popular policy for capitalists of both ruling parties for decades now. But if you're talking about having a protest around homelessness or the housing crisis or anything like that, you'll get zero media attention. But as soon as an anarchist stubs his toe, shouting at a Proud Boy, that's going to be like national
Right.
national
Right.
news. So there's
Right.
been this really distorted phenomenon of media coverage around here, which has given people here and outside of Portland a totally distorted idea about what the city is all about.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Going on.
That's very interesting. Yeah, you wrote in your Counterpunch article how the media narrative has changed. Originally, there'd be a total blackout of any leftist demonstrations as much as possible. It
Yeah.
changed a little when Trump got in after 2016, where they would talk about leftist or broad progressive movements, but they'd fit it into their own narrow lens. Like they were pushing identity politics really hard, but as you said, they didn't want to focus on interracial solidarity. They really hate that. They were really focusing Black Lives Matter movement. They were focusing strictly, like almost trying to keep communities apart in some ways. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I mean, I think that what the media does is it's I think it's actually so subtle for some of them involved with the media that my guess is that some of the young reporters working for NPR and CNN may not even be aware of the role that they're playing, and
Right.
and I think that that's partly because of their lack of political education or their lack of education generally, in on the part of the people running those networks. I imagine that at some point there's real conscious there's a real conscious program going on here, policy, which is intended to divide and conquer us. But I think it's working very well, their divide and conquer program. And I think basically it involves highlighting atrocities currently and especially in the past, and deliberately not talking about the many social movements, interracial, multiracial, explicitly anti-racist social movements that have existed, that have been very actively opposing those kinds of racist policies. So what we hear about is the pogroms, the massacres, the lynchings, the institutional racism, the laws, the exclusion laws, and all these things are things, of course, that we all should know about in great detail. But as we learn about things like the Tulsa Race Massacre, we should also learn about the Battle of Blair Mountain, which happened 3 months prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre in the same year, in the same country, and in a different state. And in West Virginia, you had 15,000 miners rising up against the coal mine operators with arms. 2,000 of the 15,000 miners were black. This was a multiracial working class uprising in West Virginia, which most people know nothing about. If they know anything about it, they don't know how much black participation there was. If they know anything about West Virginia, they never even think about black people. They think about the stereotypical whatever their stereotypical idea they have is of it's going to be a white guy, chewing on tobacco leaf and talking with a thick accent. And I mean, it's just this stereotypical idea they have about who populates West Virginia and so much other places that where people get, Oklahoma is another place where,
Right.
the people there will tend to get, I mean, prior to the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1917, the state crushed an uprising in Oklahoma, which was led by a group called the Working Class Union, which had 35,000 estimated secret members, many of whom were black and brown and indigenous. It had women and people of color, people of color, at all levels of the organization, including leadership. This organization was crushed, along with the Industrial Workers of the World, another multiracial, multi-gender organization that was explicitly anti-racist. These movements were deliberately crushed and then erased from the history books. So then we hear about the massacres that happened in the very same year or the very same summer as multiracial uprisings that were crushed also happen. And how is it that we don't hear about that? That's very intentional on the part of the media and the schools. And basically, for a very long time, they've had a policy of not talking about class divisions in this society
Right.
and not talking about the labor movement and the history of the labor movement, which is the most explicitly anti-racist, broad-based movement that has ever existed. And it's just erased.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Off the wall question, but what do you think of Settlers by Jay Sakai? I actually think it's crap, but
I haven't read it. It
okay.
sounds like crap. Everything I've heard about it has been negative, so
Right.
I haven't
You're
bothered
not
reading it.
missing much. Yeah, it's it substitutes class for race. But okay, anyway, yeah, it's interesting history, a whole history that we're not made aware of uh, deliberately, as you say. Finally, there was some controversy. You interviewed was it Matt Heimbeck? He was a neo-Nazi, apparently a Strasserite. He was in a group called the Traditionalist Workers Party, which imploded. Some bizarre. I don't remember. I think he was. I don't know. Anyways, he was sleeping with his father-in-law's wife or something bizarre like that. Anyway, he apparently in high school he was a leftist originally, and he took a odd direction, and apparently he you had an email exchange with him, and then more recently he left the Nazi movement. Maybe he's looking for something, maybe he's back to being a leftist. I don't know, but you got a lot of criticism for that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I mean, I got mean, it's hard to know even where to start because it's
Sure.
a big
Well,
can of worms.
well,
But
whatever you feel
basically,
comfortable talking about.
I'm happy to talk about any of it. It's just trying to make sense of it is another matter. But basically, during the Capitol siege on last January, I thought it would be very sensible to talk to somebody who might be able to understand who these people are who are laying siege to the Capitol. And so I had been in touch with Matthew Heimbach by email for, I guess, I don't know, a couple years since he basically had some big went through some major changes politically in his own head, and in the years soon after being involved with organizing the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I wanted to talk with him, knowing that he had been a fascist and knowing that he was now having some lots and lots of very big second thoughts about all that, and knowing that he was and is a very articulate, thoughtful person. So, and who had a lot of insight into why people joined the right,
Yeah.
and all kinds of insight that I already had as well, because I grew up in this country and I'm a white guy and I understand, what these debates are about and why people join the right, and it's not very mysterious to me.
Right.
But I so I had what I thought was a very interesting interview, which I got a lot of shit for, um, which I also got some shit for reasons that I think are perfectly legitimate, which is basically that I should have done more of an introduction, more contextualizing of who this guy was that I was talking to before just like jumping, into it and sort of letting people draw their own conclusions. Agreeing with that criticism, I did take the interview down with the intention of ultimately putting it back up in a more contextualized form, which
Okay.
is taking a long time because I don't get paid for this. So, eventually it will be back up in a more contextualized form. But I got a lot of shit for doing the interview and for platforming a fascist, which
Mm.
of course I didn't do because he's not a fascist. But but of course other people think he is, and therefore I'm a fascist platformer, and therefore I'm a fascist.
Yeah.
So I have been called a fascist. So many more times than I ever had been in
Yeah,
my
you're
life
actually the
prior.
least fascist guy I know. One of the least fascist people, most anti-fascist people I know. I think
No, I'm definitely
certainly.
not a fascist, and anybody who calls me a fascist is extremely confused at best, and
Right.
at worst is working for the FBI.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, there may be some COINTEL stuff going on behind the scenes and some of that.
There is definitely COINTEL stuff going on behind the scenes.
Yeah,
There's absolutely no question about that. I mean, it's just a question of to what extent and who are the cops and who aren't the cops. But the audacity that some of these people have to suggest that by saying that there's infiltrators in their ranks, that I'm the term like to use is cop jacketing them. That's nonsense.
yeah,
If you're on the left, then you're in an infiltrated organization. If you deny that, then you're either an idiot or a cop.
yeah. We can take
There's
it for
other
granted.
possibilities.
Right, right. Interesting. Yeah, I think it's good for people on left to talk to people. There are these like purity tests. I feel like Glenn Greenwald got a lot of shit for being on Tucker Carlson several times, and you could make Tucker Carlson is a reprehensible character. But he has the largest platform, and some other leftists, Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore, a bunch of other people warned Tucker Carlson, and he has a platform. I don't particularly he's a repulsive figure, but object is to talk to working class people. The thing about Tucker Carlson, he's anti-systemic. He's wrong, but he does criticize like the ruling class. When you listen to him, he initially sounds like a Marxist until he gets into bashing immigrants and all this other shit. So, people cancel Glenn Greenwald because he was in Tucker Carlson. Oh, he's red brown. I think the term red brown is used way too much. It describes some people, but it's used way too much. It's very destructive to the left. Like there's this guy, a journalist in Seattle, in Portland, Alexander Reed Ross. he's been popularizing calling everyone on anyone who's like anti-imperialist, the PSL, Max Blumenthal, a certain segment of the left, whether or not you agree with them, whether or not you agree with Max Blumenthal or the PSL on their takes, is like calling so many people red brown. There's some vast fascist conspiracy based in
Yeah.
Russia, which I think is kind of damaging to the left. I mean, we can have debates. There are lots of debates to be had about Syria, about tons of other stuff, but without labeling your opponent a red brown fascist or stuff that's kind of damaging to the left.
Yeah, it's very damaging. This kind of call out culture, this kind of intolerance is it's rife. It's damaging. It's basically what has destroyed this movement that the media dubbed the racial justice movement. It imploded. It imploded not because of a lack of passion around the issues, which of course there's lots of passion around because they're very real issues, but racism and police brutality and the mass incarceration and half our money going to the police and all that, very real issues for lots of people, not just for black people either. But the movement imploded, and it imploded because of this kind of cancel culture domination of the movement by people who like to call each other names all the time, who call people like me red brown or brown red, whatever the term they like to use. Which is what these people lack is an understanding of history and an understanding of what fascism is and isn't.
Right.
So, I mean, what these people, and of course, some of them have written books about history, which I have not read, and they probably suck because how could they not suck when you hear what these people are saying? I mean, they obviously don't know anything about history. National Socialism. National Socialism. That's the term. That's the term. Everybody needs to know that term. National Socialism. National Socialism is what we call Nazis, what we call fascists and Nazis, whatever we call them. They call themselves in the 1930s. They called themselves National Socialists, and the term National Socialist was a term that they embraced because they were wanting to. They wanted because they could see that socialism was very popular, and they just wanted to embrace this concept of a government that was serving the interests of the elements of the people, the working class that they thought were important. In the case of National Socialism in Germany, we're talking about, of course, the non-Jewish Germans and the non-left-wing Germans, but or those willing to leave the left and join the Nazis, which many did. That was who they were appealing to, right? And but at least among that element of the population, they wanted to serve that element of the population and win over their hearts and minds in order to then pursue a broader agenda, the agenda of the big corporations. Because the National Socialists were mostly organizing against Bolshevism, right? They were mostly organizing. They were a reaction to the Russian Revolution, and there was a lot of fear among large elements of the capitalist class as well as other elements of society in Europe and North America in the years following the Russian Revolution that this kind of thing was going to take off elsewhere. And of course, there very nearly was a revolution after the First World War ended in Germany itself as well. So there were these fears, and as a result, there was huge support for National Socialists, for the Nazis, from the U.S., from many elements in U.S. society, and very much from the banks, loaning them lots and lots of money. Without the U.S. banks and without a lot of U.S. corporations, it's unlikely that the Nazis in Germany would have made the kind of progress in terms of the militarization of Germany during the years prior to the what we think of as the beginning of the Second World War, which really began much sooner than it's generally given credit for having begun. Because when it began, it was in Spain, and it was in a country that the U.S. and Britain and France, whose government they did not support, and all those governments declared a neutrality, but really they were happy to see the Nazis uh, overthrow Spanish democracy. Nobody in the Western bourgeois democracies was supporting Spanish democracy because it wasn't bourgeois democracy. It was calling for land reform and things like that. So that's not anything that you want that the U.S. or the so-called Democrats in the U.K. places like that, they don't want land reform.
Right.
So I mean the so I mean in this context, what was National Socialism doing, and what was it trying to do, and who was it trying to win over? I mean, these things have to be understood, and yet and the reason they have to be understood is because these elements are talking about exactly the same kinds of stuff today, and they're trying to win over the populations that they were trying to win over before. They're trying to win over them today with the same kind of rhetoric.
Uh-huh.
And the Republican Party, at least certain elements of it, like Trump, they're really trying to win over the working class. They're talking about the workers. Trump and Sanders were the two candidates who were talking about the working class when they were running for their respective offices at the times that they were running. They were the two who were so popular because they were talking about the working class. And if we are just going to ignore that and pretend that Trump was popular and is popular only because he's a racist, well, then we're missing so much of what is making him popular, and we're missing out on so much of what is potentially our ability to communicate with his white supporters.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, the idea that we should just write these people off because they have a lot of messed up ideas
Right.
is crazy, because and what it is it's not just crazy. It's performative circular firing squad idiocy. It is the call out culture, cancel culture idiocy. It is this mentality, this puritanical idiocy. It is this mentality that says that being right is all that matters, being correct is all that matters, being moral, being pure, but not actually accomplishing anything. And to all of those people who just want to be right, uh, you know, just go kill yourself. Then you can be really right. You can't make any mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But leave the world for the rest of us who want to actually accomplish something.
Right.
Let's communicate with each other, and let's be willing to be wrong, and let's be willing to actually be challenged, not to be just condemned as a fascist or an anti-Semite or whatever. That's not challenging. That's no. Let's actually really communicate, and let's hear what people think, and why they feel the way they do, and let's offer an alternative, because ultimately, really, it's not even about so much about communication as it is about offering a real alternative. The rise of National Socialism is a direct consequence of the failure of socialism.
Huh.
National Socialism rises when socialism fails. Fascist and right-wing movements become popular when the movements that are supposed to be, and the parties and the unions that are supposed to be representing the people, fail to do so. National Socialism became very popular in Germany because the Social Democrats were failing to feed the German people.
Right.
And National Socialism did not take off to the same degree in the United States because we had a competent government that was feeding the people at the time, led by Franklin Roosevelt, who, for all his faults, was actually trying to feed the people of the country, and largely succeeded in doing so. And of course, he himself admitted that, what did he say? I'm this kind of socialist because I'm this kind of capitalist, or something. Like, I can't
Yeah.
remember the quote, but he wasn't necessarily instituting all these policies out of the goodness of his heart. He was very political and pragmatic and about it. But that he was the reason, and that movement, and the socialist movement in the United States at the time was the reason why National Socialism was less popular, even though it was quite popular. It was less popular here than it was in Germany, because of different circumstances. Not because there were fewer people with those more people with those ideas in Germany compared to here. It was really about the circumstances of the two countries, and who was leading the countries at the time.
Yeah.
Fascism was very popular in England. It was very popular in France. I
Yeah.
mean, it, fascism was very popular in a lot of places, and for all the same reasons in those places. And if we're just gonna, say no, we can't try to understand why fascism was popular in all those places. We can't understand what was the rhetoric that was appealing to people. We just have to call them Nazis and try to, you know, shoot them or whatever we're going to do and have a shootout in the streets of Portland or whatever that's supposed to solve the problem. I don't know. I mean, this kind of intolerance, this kind of like idea of no, we can't talk to the Nazis. We just have to oppose them and fight them. The consequences of that kind of mentality in the past have been absolutely devastating for humanity. I
Yeah.
mean, if there were ever any possibility of preventing the rise of National Socialism in Germany, then that would have been the thing to do to actually prevent the rise of National Socialism. And what happened did not do that.
Mhm.
And what happened did involve a whole lot of street fighting and a whole lot of intolerance and a whole lot of opposing ideas and opposing people in ways that were extremely sectarian. And we have not progressed
Yeah.
since then, and we need to. And these people who are calling me red, brown, red, brown, red, whatever, they are part of the problem,
Yeah.
and they
Exactly.
have been for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Like in the 20s, the Comintern, they called like the Social Democrats in Germany social fascist. They call like anyone who's not them basically fascist,
Yep,
which helped give rise to real fascism. Pretty
I
disturbing.
think it did. I
Yeah,
think it did. Yeah.
pretty
I mean,
disturbing.
not that that by itself is what gave rise to fascism, but that it was a big contributing factor.
Yeah, well, thanks. Right. Well, overall, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future, or hard to tell?
I'm only optimistic when I'm in the middle of a big social movement that's happening. So right now, I'm not at all optimistic.
Yeah.
But I think my whether I'm feeling optimistic or not has little to do with what's going on the ground in the world. It really, if I'm being used as a musician to be a cheerleader for an actually existing social movement that sees the value in music and is using it to great effect. As I've been, had great pleasure of being part of social movements like that in history and in the recent past in different countries. And whenever I'm part of a movement like that, I'm feeling optimistic, regardless of the movement's prospects for actual success. And when I'm not in a movement like that and it's not happening, then I tend to feel like the future looks really dismal. But I mean, in reality, I really have no idea whether there's reason to be optimistic or not, because from my experience and from my reading of history, social movements can accomplish just about anything
Mhm.
if they're big enough and militant enough and well organized enough. But their absence is absolutely devastating. So
Yeah.
I mean, and of course they can be crushed, and are generally that's what happens to them generally. So but I'm just waiting for the next one. And I think there's lots of possibilities for transformation of humanity and society and saving the planet. All kinds of things can be accomplished if enough people set their minds to it in an organized way in the form of a global social movement.
Yeah, I
But
hope. Yeah, yeah. I
it's
hope
not
a
happening.
decent. Yeah, hope a decent
Mhm.
left evolves in this country in the near future. But we'll see. Okay,
Yep,
I'm gonna have to
that's what
go
we
soon.
need.
Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that was a wonderful, wide ranging bunch of topics.
Thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed talking with you. Where can people find your work now?
Oh, they just davidrovics.com. They can
Okay.
find everything there. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And where's your next gig? Are you touring the U.S. in the near future?
No, I haven't actually had a tour in the US in many years because
Okay.
of the financial
Yeah.
realities. I pretty much just tour in Europe
Right.
now.
Right.
And looks like I'll be going back to Europe in February, March, April, and May.
Sounds good. Cool. Sounds good. Cool. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate.
Really. Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.